Hello, and welcome to a new podcast going through the filmography of Akira Kurosawa. My name is Robert Beams, and I'm joined by my regular co-host, Craig Ennis.
Hello.
Hello, Craig.
It's good to be here.
And basically, we're starting a podcast with the intention of going through the films, the 30 feature films of Akira Kurosawa that he made as director from his debut with Sugata Sanshiro up until his final film, Madadeo. And we're going to do podcasts for each of those. Some of the earlier ones we're going to join together, as you'll see today, but we're going to cover all of those. And the angle that we're coming at this from is that I'm a long-time Kurosawa fan. I've got my Seven Samurai t-shirt on today, and Craig, your relationship with Kurosawa is a little bit different.
Yeah, mine is quite a shameful relationship with Akira Kurosawa. So much like yourself, Rob, we've both done film degrees in our younger days, but somehow I have never, up till a week ago, seen an Akira Kurosawa film. Which, and in my job as a teacher at a film school, is quite shameful. And I know very little. Well, we'll talk about our past relationships with Akira Kurosawa films, but it is a glaring omission through my film knowledge. So the kind of idea was that I would come to these things not as fresh as I can be. I know some of the background, but I've never having seen one. I'm going to be here with the hot takes on these 70-year-old films.
So before we carry on, I mean, today as anyone who's downloaded this as a podcast, who's watching this on YouTube, hello, is aware that we're covering Sugata Sanshiro today, his first film, which came out in 1943, and also skipping over a film which we will get to next time, his second film, to go straight to Sugata Sanshiro Part II, because it makes sense to kind of do them together. The second film is very much a kind of direct sequel going off where the first one ends, so we're going to kind of bundle those together. Before we get into that, maybe give some background. I mean, you've mentioned that you're a film teacher, but maybe give a bit more background about where you come from, and then I'll talk about my side.
Yeah, so as I've mentioned before, both did film degrees, film studies degrees. I was much more focused on horror, science fiction, fantastic cinema, and sort of narrative theory and filmmaking during my studying years, and then that sort of carried on into practice. So I'm still a filmmaker, documentaries mainly, and behind the scenes content for Blu-rays and that kind of thing. And these days, my time is mainly spent nurturing undergraduates at the Screen and Film School in Brighton. So that's kind of where I've landed after graduating 16 years ago.
Yeah, okay. I come at it from a pretty different background, as you obviously know. Talking to a friend I've had for years, as if we've just meeting on this podcast. I also studied film studies, as you mentioned, and then I went more. I've never really gone the practical route in terms of filmmaking. Not really done any kind of student films or anything like that. I was much more down the theoretical end, and went into film journalism for a while, and I've drifted away from that over the years and done other things in my career, but I've always maintained sort of that obsession with movies and that kind of passion for watching things. And my sort of relationship with Kurosawa films, in particular, to go into that, is it's a fairly kind of boring, predictable start, I guess, in that I was studying when I was doing film studies. There was a module for Japanese cinema. And I took that module, and as part of that, we watched 2 Kurosawa films over the course of that kind of term or whatever module, and they were Yajimbo and Hidden Fortress. and I ended up basically finding off the back of that. My first, I won't spoil anything because obviously we're going in fresh to all the films as we go. But my first reaction to Hidden Fortress was that I found it really dull, and I really wasn't into it. And then I kind of reluctantly watched Yajimbo because I had to for the course, and absolutely loved it. And the university film library, basically, I found they had all of his films either on DVD or VHS tapes back then as well. And I ended up kind of going into the library successive days and just sitting down with like an old CRT, like little TV, and watching VHS cassettes of all the Kurosawa films they had and things like that. Ended up really binging in close succession back then, like almost all of them. I think it was only the very earliest ones, like the ones we're going to talk about today, and some of the ones that followed that I wasn't able to watch at the time until they more recently came out on like a BFI DVD collection, the early films of Kurosawa. But I watched all the ones I could get hold of back then. And then in the last sort of 5 years, I've watched most of them again, at least another time, a few of them more than once. Because I was showing them to my wife as well, and she was interested in them. So we went through a lot of them again, and I've seen, a few of them, like Seven Samurai and Rashomon and Yajimbo, like I've seen a lot of times. But that's sort of where I come at this from. I'm to give background onto my interest in film, like I'm not a kind of a Japanese cinema specialist. Like my background with Japanese cinema, I love me some Ozu. I've seen quite a lot of Ozu. I've seen the main Mizoguchis that get brought up. I've seen scattered bits of Kobayashi and Naruse and other kind of people from that era, the kind of classics. And then after that, I've seen, the Ashima films that you have to watch if you study a Japanese cinema course, like The Realm of the Senses. And, I've seen, Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence, and then more recently stuff like Takashi Miike, Takashi Kitano, and then those scattered things that come out every now and again, like Shoplifters, for example, where kind of a Japanese film breaks out. But other than that, I haven't really got a deep knowledge of the Japanese film industry or of Japanese cinema broadly, kind of certainly in live action. What's your sort of? I know you've got kind of a famously, at least within our circles, a famous sort of famously eclectic kind of love of film. How much have you really gone into it with Japanese cinema in particular?
Well, just to really diminish the expectations of our listenership here. Yeah, I similarly have a very limited knowledge of Japanese cinema. Miike and Kitano are the kind of my main touch point, sort of early 2000s extreme cinema, Audition and
Battle Royale, and yeah,
absolutely very formative in terms of this era of Japanese cinema. Like I've seen 2 Ozu films, both of which are very early silent ones. I flunked But and I Was Born But, right. And I really liked I Was Born But. But yeah, no, it's a real blind spot for me. Like, I've not seen Tokyo Story. I've not seen Nigetsu Monogatari. Not for any other reason. I mean, I think, as far as Kurosawa is concerned, to get us back on where we're supposed to be a little bit, I know the basics. I know that he was influenced by John Ford, and then the subsequent westerns took the influence back from Kurosawa. I know that there's a lot of remaking of his films, and I know and Yajimbo, and obviously became. I'm right, I'm not even saying this with confidence, but Yajimbo was Fistful of Dollars.
Yeah, it was basically in some places shot for shot. Yeah.
And Throne of Blood was Macbeth. I know that Magnificent Seven was, but I've only ever seen the remake of the Magnificent Seven. I've not even seen the classic movie. I growing up in a house with just my mother. The Magnificent Seven, the Leone films, the Bank Holiday Dad specials all passed me by, so I never had that connection to those films that were being cited to go back and check out the where they came from. So this is all quite new to me, and I think the other thing that put me off for a long time was the running time of the Seven Samurai, because that was the one. That was the one that you was told that you were supposed to watch, and to begin with, that was supposed to be the entrance film. And I remember getting it out from the library, much like I took it out rather than sat at the CRT, and then looking it up and realizing how long it was, and deciding to go to the pub instead. I remember that evening. So this is for me, this podcast is the correction of a youthful mistake that's been a long time coming. Actually, because I certainly don't remember the night out.
Yeah, I will get to it when we get to it with Seven Samurai. I'm looking forward to you watching it. But I think you'll be pleasantly surprised. I think one of the things with Akira Kurosawa is a lot of those, like for example Mizoguchi, maybe even to some extent Ozu, although I'm a real diehard Ozu boy as well. But Mizoguchi, like, that's homework. Like when I sit down and watch a Mizoguchi film, I do feel that sort of like, I better watch this, that sort of aspect. But Kurosawa's films, they are, and some of their detractors, would probably say this as well. They are popcorn, a lot of them. Like they're very, very beautifully composed, really amazingly made, like on a technical level. But they're crowd pleasers. Which is one of the reasons that, as we'll go into with this film, he had problems over the years with Japanese censors and also Japanese critics and audiences. Like for a long time, his reputation in Japan was a lot less kind of good than it is in the Western world. And part of the reason for that is that he basically makes Hollywood movies with Japanese characters in them, Japanese settings. And so Seven Samurai and Yajimbo, they become westerns very naturally when it happens. Like like in particular in the case of Fistful of Dollars, like that is very close to the Kurosawa film, and is only changed in a few ways, really. But yeah, so I'm looking forward to getting stuck into those ones with you. I'll say as well, just before we go in and start talking about Sanshiro Sugata, that this podcast is obviously going to be going in spoilers, because we're going to talk about each film as it comes up. We're going to talk about them in whatever detail, whatever kind of way the conversation is interesting to go down with them. But I would say this podcast, by virtue of the fact that I'm sort of the kind of quote unquote expert and Craig's coming in at this blind, this podcast hopefully going to be good for both audiences, whether you're coming to this because you love Kurosawa films and you want to hear some people discuss each one as they come and kind of relive that, or if you want to come and do this with us and watch along with us. And being Craig's position, I think hopefully it'll be fun either way. As well, I just wanted to kind of bring up at the start, I mean, how much, before I go off on some long waffle, like how much do you know about Kurosawa right now biographically?
I know about his hat that was in quite a lot of the pictures that I've seen of him. He had kind of like one of those bucket hats that were very popular during the Manchester scene. That's about it. That was nothing else to say. We're gonna keep this hopefully entertaining as well. Hopefully we're not gonna suit it up too much.
Yeah, it's not gonna be too arch.
No.
But we're not gonna shirk at talking about the mise en scène, but we're also gonna laugh when appropriate. And I think there's plenty of points in these two Sugata Sanshiro films where I have nothing constructive to say. But I want to say as well at the beginning, I'll talk just very briefly about Akira Kurosawa's sort of early life and kind of what led him up to this film, very, very briefly. I will just say as well that during all of these podcasts, there are two sources that I will be referring to a lot. If I don't refer to them directly, a lot of what I know about Kurosawa kind of comes from these sources outside of what I know from the films. And that is the definitive book on Akira Kurosawa by Donald Ritchie, the films of Akira Kurosawa, that features lots of quotes and interviews with him that were conducted by Don Ritchie. It goes in detail through every single one of his 30 films. It goes in detail talking about very deep analysis of the cinematic techniques involved, the plot, the performance. It goes into sections of performances and story, and for every single one of the movies. And Donald Ritchie is also not shy about giving his sort of opinion on them all as well, and interpreting the imagery in them. And it's a very good book. And the second one, which every Kurosawa film should read, is Something Like an Autobiography, which is Kurosawa's autobiography, which only really covers his early life and his first films. There's sort of long-standing, I don't know about controversy, but there's kind of long-standing debate about why the book ends when it does, because he ends the book around about the time Rashomon makes it. And I think in the book itself, if I remember, he attributes that to the fact that the rest of his life is just told through his films, and he wants to leave it to his films. But I remember, for example, Alex Cox, who often turns up on BFI Kurosawa DVDs as a talking head, and I think Alex Cox made a documentary about Kurosawa as well, which I've never actually been able to track down. I think it's called The Last Emperor. And I know Alex Cox speculated it might be because he had such a long-standing working collaboration with the actor Toshiro Mifune, who we won't meet in these films today, but who's in all of his kind of great movies, and that because they fell out quite badly, Kurosawa and Mifune never reconciled. There's speculation that maybe he ends his biography at that point because he doesn't really want to talk about Mifune too much. But either way, he kind of ends the biography fairly early. So, I mean, to give the very broad strokes overview of Akira Kurosawa's life prior to Sanshiro Sugata, he was born in to a samurai family, like class-wise. That doesn't necessarily mean his dad was like walking around with a sword or whatever, but the samurai class was sort of, and he was in that bloodline. And as part of that, he was very interested growing up in traditional Japanese, samurai stuff, but also he kind of was encouraged to come up with the traditional interests in things like practicing calligraphy, painting and kendo and things like that. And he kind of came up with that discipline and having to do those particular things, which probably influenced some of the interests you see in his films, but also kind of his aesthetic styles and things like that. He was extremely close to it's Heigo. He was the youngest of 7 siblings, but his brother that was kind of one up older from him, Heigo, was apparently a very skilled painter, or at least Kurosawa says he was an extremely skilled painter, and he's very kind of very influential to the young Kurosawa, took him to the movies, introduced him to cinema a lot of the time. And Heigo killed himself quite young, and that's one of the things that marks Kurosawa's sort of autobiography, and is something that he always said later in life he never got over, was the death of his brother. Something that he and Heigo did early in their youth, which I think also affected Kurosawa quite strongly, was that they were both in Tokyo during the Great Kanto earthquake, or in the aftermath of it. So the young Kurosawa describes in his autobiography quite vividly scenes of death and destruction. Like he saw that as a young man, like he saw the effects of this earthquake on people. And other than that, I think relevant would probably be the fact that I think another interesting detail to bring up, because I won't go into some deep dive on his biography because it's not really what we're here for. But another thing I'd mention as well is that my understanding of the Japanese studio system at the time is that an assistant director is very different in Japan. I don't know about today, but back when Kurosawa was coming up in the 30s, 40s, 50s, an assistant director was like an apprenticeship to be a director. It was a direct sort of line. You learned from a master, then you became a director, and that's what it was. Whereas in the Western world, an assistant director is just a different job. You don't necessarily have to be an assistant director before becoming a director. And in fact, I would struggle to name many directors who used to be assistant directors. It doesn't seem to work that way. But for Kurosawa, for Ozu, for Mizoguchi, for all of them, they came up in a system where they learned under a director and were assistant directors for many years. Kurosawa worked under Yamamoto, I think. Kajiro Yamamoto. And towards the end of his work as an assistant director for Yamamoto, it's mentioned a few times times in the books I mentioned before, both by Kurosawa directly, but also by Yamamoto, that some of their last collaborations together were basically Kurosawa movies. The Yamamoto just sort of let Kurosawa at it, like their film before. Kurosawa's last film as assistant, I think, before he made Sanshiro Sugata, was one called Horses, I believe. Might have a longer title than that, but it's got horses in the title. And that film, Kurosawa mentions a few times that he felt like that was his first film as director, and that Yamamoto sort of admits that he left Kurosawa to figure most of that out. So he isn't coming in completely blind when he makes Sanshiro Sugata, but he made Sanshiro Sugata's first film as director at the age of 32, came out when he was 33 in 1943. But that's the background. That's how we get there. So, I mean, I can talk more about the production of Sanshiro Sugata because he covers that a lot in those books and things. But maybe because I just don't want to talk too much, we should go and start about your first impressions of the film.
Okay, well, just as a kind of mechanic of this podcast, I've obviously not been doing the same level of research or have any of that knowledge. And as a kind of as a conceit, if you like, I'm going to be limiting myself to the synopses on the BFI player or wherever I find these, and a cursory but not thorough glance at the Wikipedia entries.
Nice.
To try and keep that freshness, approaching these films freshly.
That sounds good.
Nothing to do with laziness at all. So yeah, I mean, like I say, I've been watching a lot of old cinema recently. It was kind of one of my lockdown projects, was to work my way through the films that Mark Cousins recommends in A Story of Film. And I was doing that chronologically, trying to watch a lot of silent cinema. I think I've made my ways made into about the 30s by the time the idea for this podcast came up. So I kind of had in my head where I thought this would be stylistically, in terms of how much camera movement we were going to get, what the staging would be, that kind of thing. And the synopsis to me basically kind of put in my head that what I was watching was basically going to be a sports film. And I kind of feel like, to a certain degree, that's what I got out of it. I thought it was interesting earlier when you were talking about those films lending themselves to Westerns and to Western narratives, because to me, this film felt like it was setting up a lot of, not setting up, but was an early example of a lot of very, very familiar sports film tropes. And yeah, exactly, and the plot structure basically.
Yeah, absolutely. That's something that struck me the first time I saw this film, was that it is. I don't know. I'm not as versed in sports movies and fight movies to know this for sure, but it kind of felt to me watching this like, if there's no this, there's no Karate Kid. Like, it just feels like there's a clear line of this being like all of the touch points are there for that sort of movie.
Yeah, no, that's exactly what I thought it was, because I've watched a few martial arts films from the sort of 70s, 80s onwards that tend to be, I guess, a little bit more. Well, Enter the Dragon famously was kind of Bond inspired, wasn't it? And you kind of get that strand of martial arts films that comes through around about then, which is one of the biggest strands of martial arts films that I'm familiar with, that are spy films with combat, basically. Whereas this was martial arts within a structured tournament, like you say, Karate Kid, isn't it? Not quite a tournament, but
but structured fights in dojos, and
exactly that sort of thing. And you've got the stoic master, you've got the petulant kid who needs to be shown the way of the world and kind of just cool his boots a little bit. And
it's even it's completely what you're saying in terms of the sports movie, but it's a cliche even that extends to things like, you know, the J.J. Abrams Star Trek. Like very early in this film, Sanshiro Sugata is just having some drunken brawl, and then he's called into the master and told that he just, you know, he's a talented man, goddammit, but he needs to kind of sit straight and fly right and show some respect, and, you know, or he's never going to make it, you know. And it basically, it does hit those beats, doesn't it, that you kind of expect.
It hits them absolutely perfect. You know, like just exactly right, to the point where the villain is introduced at the right time after there's already been some sort of fall from the protagonist as well. You've got the sort of forbidden love story, or the kind of star-crossed lovers story in there as well. Everything kind of hits really, really nicely. And what struck me about the early what struck me about it in the early parts was that there was, I mean, if I'm honest, you know, I think it's obviously it's old and it's quite staid and staged in places, and the dialogue scenes are quite often just a bit too static and a bit too long. But I was quite pleased to see there was quite a few nice little visual flourishes in there, that just straight off the bat. And I don't know how frequent wipes were used in Japanese cinema in the early 40s, but to see one within the first couple of minutes and that kind of thing was really good. I liked the staging of the fights as well. I liked that they seemed to be they were shot for drama rather than violence. There's this, the camera's very much focused on people's faces and not the physical spectacle of the fighting. And I don't know if that's just because I don't know judo well enough to know if it is or isn't inherently cinematic.
It's interesting what you say about, like, for example, not knowing how much wipes were sort of involved in Japanese films at the time, because that's obviously something as well that I have set up front. I don't really know that background of it, but I was reading through the Donald Ritchie book yesterday for this film, and he very much is an expert. Like he's written definitive books on all the great Japanese filmmakers over the years, and he's kind of very much embedded in that world of Japanese cinema, certainly of this era. And he writes very effusively. I mean, spoiler, just to show that he isn't just gushing because he knows Kurosawa and he loves his films. He writes 10 pages about Sugata Sanshiro, but then 2 for the sequel, and the 2 for the sequel begin with a line that says, "It is so very bad." So he doesn't pull his punches on that. So when he talks about the first film, and he talks about how it's very unlike any films of that era and very like any other films that were coming out of Japan at the time or anywhere else. He talks specifically, he mentions the wipes, but he also mentions things like the pacing and the editing and all these things that he talks about, how there's that sequence that plays with time and how that comes many years before the one with the where he's meeting the woman on the steps and her kimono in each shot, because it's actually taking place over time. And he compares that to, what would come later in Citizen Kane and in French New Wave films. So he's kind of very much drawing a line saying that this is an originator point for a lot of that stuff. And he definitely suggests this is all quite new.
Well, I hadn't seen a lot of whip pans before 1933. I'm sure there must be some, but it's not something that you
you see a lot.
You see a fair few whip pans, and there's is it in the climactic battle, or is it in the?
Are you thinking about the whip pan in the dojo when it goes from his face onto the crowd? Because that was a great one.
That's the one. When it's the mid film fight.
The mid film fight.
Where it goes straight on the crowd, and there's this very slow pan back towards him, or it's either a pan or it's a very small slow push. I can't remember, but the camera was moving a lot more than I'd expected
Yeah,
to.
yeah. It starts with a shot I thought was amazing, which Ritchie highlights in his writing as well. But where it turns out it's a POV shot. It doesn't seem originally like a POV shot. It's just kind of like pushing through a street. The film starts. It's kind of the camera's just going down this little town, and then it turns down an alleyway, and there are these women in the alleyway, and then we see from the women's point of view, and we're looking at Sugata Sanshiro, our hero. So then we know, oh, okay, that was POV. We were going down the street, and then we turned into the alleyway, and he has that first conversation with them about wanting to find somewhere to train and all of that business. But that struck me as very very interesting visually for the era as well. I also really like, and I feel like we should probably sidebar and take just quickly go over the synopsis of what the film is.
Oh yeah,
but also like the opening fight, the first fight. I really love the stage.
Yeah, we're talking about on the docks here.
Yeah, on the docks. But I'll talk very quickly about what the film's about. So as you might have gathered already from what we've said, it's a fight film. There's this young kid at the beginning. He doesn't look like a kid, he looks like a 30-year-old man, but a fresh-faced Sanshiro Sugata, played by an extremely gormless actor. He basically he wants to become a fighter. He ends up training in a dojo. He's not very good at, he's very talented at first, but he's not got the right attitude. He's a hothead. And then, some guy wants to come and fight him to the death for reasons that have to do with the kind of clash of styles between jiu-jitsu and judo. It's quite interesting because, and this parallels quite interestingly with the sequel, because Sugata Sanshiro in its way is quite, I won't say progressive because that's got connotations, but it's forward-looking insofar as judo, because I did a little bit of research on it. Judo was conceived in the 1880s as part of modern Japan. It was very deliberately created, not just as a fighting style, but as a moral, kind of a set of morals and a kind of spirituality. And it was supposed to be a break from jiu-jitsu, which had like a samurai tradition and came from the past and was like this ancient art that was used, come from India hundreds of years before, and this new Japan. So in a way, the first film, Sugata Sanshiro, has this thing going through it of this new Japanese idea coming out past maybe an old Japanese idea, whereas the sequel goes completely the other way. It becomes about preserving what's currently going on in Japan and telling Westerners to piss off.
Can we hold fire on that?
Yeah.
Just for a sec. But that's one of the things I found really interesting about it. I don't think I've seen a film based around judo, because like I say, cinematically it's throwing and tripping, isn't it? It's my understanding of judo, and I'm not an athlete, I'm not a martial artist, is that it's not a particularly aggressive martial art. It's about using people's momentum and their attacks against themselves. So there's none of that kind of satisfying bone crunching, punching and kicking. It's sort of people throwing and tumbling over each other a little bit.
And yet, Sugata Sanshiro is basically the most deadly man at throwing anybody. There is a scene in this movie where he throws somebody so hard against a wall that they die. That is something that I find, that's one of the many scenes in the film that I kind of find unintentionally funny. Because most of the time he's just sort of like chucking people a bit, and he throws them like away from the side of the room, and then they just can't get up anymore. He does at one point. And it's a really interesting. I think that's where the whip pan comes in, and then you get that shot of the guy flying through the air, but he like smashes the wall, and like the window falls down on him in slow motion. And that guy, we find out, he killed that guy by throwing him really hard against a wall, which is amusing unintentionally.
And I don't want to upset any judo masters out there, because God knows, from the safety of my little StreamYard box here, I'll smack talk judo all day, but I'm sure there's much more to it than that. But I don't think the film does any stylistic favors to portraying it. It's not, when you see people go flying, then they're not really going flying. It's not framed or shot in a particularly convincing way, should we put it that way? But that, apart from that really great fight at the start
at the docks,
yeah.
Which has an amazing, I think, pan where you follow. There's something you'll see later when you meet Toshiro Mifune and you see him in Seven Samurai and in Rashomon in particular, where Mifune takes on this sort of like cat-like pacing kind of animalistic character, and you get that with this guy that he focuses on the pan here at the docks, but you see this master standing by the water, and then it cuts to this guy and he's like pacing like menacingly to the side, and this tracking shot that follows him just shows all the other goons assembled around him, you know, like they're all like swinging their arms around and whatever. It kind of tracks past following him, and then he kind of, the shot leaves him, or you know, and then goes on to Sugata standing behind watching. I thought that was a really great the way that was framed.
Yeah, and then he sort of stands at the edge of the at the dock as the goons sort of come at him one by one and get rolled over into the harbour.
Get rolled over to the harbour. There's something I want to bring up here as well, which is, well, there are two things here which I think will become recurring themes throughout Kurosawa's films that you'll see going on and on and on. One is the kind of tension and release of any action, where most Kurosawa films, there's a very famous fight at the end of his film Sanshiro that's like this, but also in Seven Samurai as well they do this, where there'll be these long fights where most of the fight is two people looking at each other. I guess that kind of presages the Jules and the Leone movies, right? They kind of looking at each other down an alleyway and then putting their guns. It's the same thing in his films where you'll get just two characters that look at each other, they're gonna fight each other, there's gonna be violence, but first there's going to be a lot of watching each other, sizing each other up, waiting for the right moment. I think within a lot of Japanese martial arts and Japanese sword fighting, that comes because you are looking for the person to make the first move so you can kind of counter what they do. But he does this with action in all of his movies. There's this and you get that at the docks here, where the guy is he's standing waiting and they have to make the first move, and it takes a while before it happens. But then once it happens, it's bam, 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 and there's fast cutting and there's action. And you'll see that through his films. Another thing you get introduced to very early on here, and if you do any reading or watching documentaries around Kurosawa, you will hear this come up a lot as a term to describe him, which is his humanism. And an early example of his humanism here is that the baddies here at the docks, when you're introduced to them, they're not exactly just cartoon baddies. They're another group of people. They're a group of people that are they've got their own grievances. They're poor. They're clearly struggling. You know, this other guy is going to come along and take work from them. That's not to say they're noble or heroic or they're not the baddies, but they're not just villains. And that's the thing with Kurosawa in general, is that he's interested in people, and he doesn't really see anybody as being just villainous. And I think you'll see that across a lot of his films. And it's kind of, this is a kind of a weaker example of that, I think.
Well, yeah, I was going to say, I mean, because the big bad is quite literally at the start. I mean, I agree with you in this film, because it kind of goes beyond that a little bit. But the big bad is almost literally a cartoon
starch twirling villain. Yeah,
starts twirling with the gloves and the hat and the bow tie, and walks on the screen and kind of screams, "I'm the big bad." Well, not literally, but I just it's chucklesome. Yeah,
it's less subtle in this film than it is in his others, but it is something that runs through them.
And that does come back to into play in the second film in one of the nicer moments, actually. So yeah, I mean, basically, my main thoughts about the whole film really was that it was this prototypical, very. I could imagine it being very commercial. I can see why it's been remade a couple of times.
Yeah, that's something I forgot to mention at the start. It's been remade 5 times, this movie, and 2 of those times were directly using Kurosawa's screenplay. Right. And one of those times in 1965, according to the Ritchie book, one of those times Kurosawa edited it. So the 1965 remake was made by Kurosawa's production company, and Kurosawa edited it. And it's a remake not of the first film, but it's very long. It's like 3 hours long, and it's a remake of the 2 films together as one Judo Saga, which I think,
Because I did actually make a little note. I wondered if this was always originally intended as a two-parter. Yeah, no, it is the only thing missing from it, really, which is quite interesting when you think about that kimono scene. The only thing missing from it to be a completely full archetypal sports movie is a training montage. Everything else is in place.
You get that in the second film. There's a short sort of training montage where a guy progressively learns from him. But yeah, not in this one.
But as a Akira Kurosawa newbie watching his first film, I think you asked me over the text before, have I drunk the Kool-Aid yet? There's not a lot in his very first film to suggest what's to come, I don't think. But I did really like the ending, because it goes from the fight in the dojo and then goes back out again for another climactic fight in these windswept fields, these overgrown fields.
That's another Kurosawa trope you're going to see over and over again, is strong weather. Wind and rain going through grass is going to be a major.
Not a practical place for a fight. I've put in my notes, but very, very cinematic. And very, very striking. I think the main issue for me was just the length of some of those stayed conversations in locked off shots. Sitting on floors in houses that just go on a bit too long. But that's he leveled at a lot of films from that era.
Kurosawa claims in his autobiography that he wrote this in one sitting, very quickly after reading the book that it was based on. So he basically, what happened was, according to his autobiography, is that this was based on a book. He was having trouble getting a film made or being made the director of a film, because at that point you needed to get past a lot of censors. During the war in Japan, there was a lot of committees and things that had to see that you were appropriate to kind of tell a story. And so using a novel that had already been approved for publication and was dealing with very traditional themes and set during a period was seen as being more safe, like a safe thing for him to do. So when he saw that this novel was coming out, he hadn't even read it yet. He asked the studio to buy the film rights for it. They refused because he hadn't even read the book yet. But the guy said to him, well, read the book, and then if it's still good, we'll do it. So Kurosawa apparently obsessively went to all the bookstores for weeks trying to get this book, got it, read it immediately, wrote the screenplay immediately, and then went and gave it to the guy who made the film. So he didn't spend a lot of time on it, is my point. Okay. Which is probably why the dialogue is the least
it's very on the nose, isn't it? Yeah. Very on the nose. Which brings us to part two. I guess. Which I
want to talk about part one. If you're moving on, are you moving on, or are you just making an aside?
Well, I was going to talk about part two as well. I was ready to move on, but
okay. I want to talk about the pond, because I've watched this film a few times now, and the way that they talk about him being in a shallow pond of water, like he's imminently about to die, is just something that every time I've seen the film, it just baffles me and makes me laugh. Like he's in a shallow pond of water.
There's a scene where he's kind of chastised by his sensei, and he punishes himself by jumping into a small reed pond.
Yeah, and everyone's coming up to the sensei going, Sachiro's going to die. You need to get him out of that pond. And
there's a rock in the middle of it that sticks up that he holds on to. And he stays there overnight.
He's talked about like he's going to die, and then he comes out. He kind of comes out the pond in the end. But it's really talked about like the old priest or whoever he is comes out and tells him that he's just, that stick is all that's stopping him from dying in the mud. You're like, it's a small pond. So that always amuses me. And apparently, like in the Ritchie book, it was saying how that scene is not in the original novel, but he's not talking about it to criticize it, kind of like I am for being stupid. He talks about the symbolism of the flower and how Kurosawa kind of deftly sews that through the movie, which is something that's not in the book. And that's something I wanted to talk about, is that one of the things Richie says, well, actually, I think it's a quote of Kurosawa's. Let me get the quote. I think he says that he was going to make, he decided that because of the censorship and the wartime. This is a quote of Kurosawa. I decided that since I couldn't say anything very much, I would make a really movie-like movie, is what he says. What Richie attributes to being a movie-like movie isn't just the action and the pans and all the the cool stuff we've talked about, but is this idea of taking things from the book that weren't in the book and doing them through visual language. And that's one of the things with the flower. That's the way that Kurosawa tries to make the movie resonate through imagery rather than just through events and dialogue, which, as you mentioned, dialogue is not a strong point of this film, but he was trying to do that with imagery early on in the movie. I also want to mention before we move on, I really like the sequence at the beginning when they show the lapse in time by having Sanshiro discards his shoes so he can pull the rickshaw, then you just get that montage of a shoe, like the life of a shoe over over a year or something.
There is a surprising. Yeah, that does stick out. It's surprising how resonant that image is in the second part when he puts the shoes back on to carry the rickshaw. Yeah. And that shoe kind of just sticks in. I mean, I didn't quite understand why we were concentrating on the shoe. I'm sure it's got a relevance that's lost on me. But that you go through the seasons, don't you? With it sort of drifting along the streets of and sort of being kicked from pillar to post.
Yeah, and ending up in a stream and with a dog and all kinds of things. There's this weird thing. Another thing I wanted to kind of start to take a pop out with this film is I have no idea why there's such an academy of people being trained specifically to teach judo to the police department. This whole room of guys, and they're like, okay guys, like you're going to be training the police, and it's like cuts to like 6 or 7 dudes that have this job.
Again, like that's what I meant. That's why I kept thinking the Karate Kid, and I know that's not actually a part thing in the Karate Kid, but it's a very kind of 80s Breaking 2 kind of trope where there's some sort of competition or something going on where they need to save. It's like local stakes, to save the local. We've got to save the local community centre, or we've got to win the local contract, or we've got to. But that's another thing that made me really feel like this felt like a very commercial 80s sports film.
Two other things. So sorry.
Yeah, sorry. Now after you.
I was going to say 2 other things I would have mentioned before we move on to the second one. The first is just that the propagandistic element of this movie is subtle compared to the second one, which we'll come on into. But you do have the fact that the main villain, the guy he fights to the death at the end, he's westernized. He wears westernized clothes. He smokes westernized cigarettes. And that's sort of the film's only real indication that it's kind of based in the war, I would say. There's not a lot. Other than obviously the idea that it's this pride in Japanese martial ability and this kind of there's a certain amount of patriotism, I suppose, to it, but that's the most overt thing really, is that this is westernized bad guy. I'd made a note on that, but I forgot to bring it up, so thanks. And then the second thing, and this is worth bringing up, is that the father who he fights towards the end of the film, like the penultimate fight, that's the actor Takashi Shimura, who is in 31 of Kurosawa's 30 films. He is by far and away the most consistent collaborator with Kurosawa. Like Mifune, for context, is in 16 of the 30. It's Shimura who's in most of them, and certainly in all of his classic movies. And Takashi Shimura is also known famously as one of the leads in Godzilla. Have you seen the original Godzilla?
I have. Yeah, I watched it at the Duke of York's in Brighton.
Yeah, well, Takashi Shimura's in that.
I've seen the Japanese version and the Americanized version with Raymond Burr.
Yeah, but it's I wanted to flag him up anyway because he is he's very good, and he's the star, for example, of Akira, which we'll come to probably in not too long in the future. He's the leader of the Seven Samurai in that. He's a massive player in a lot of Kurosawa's films. So Did you have any? This is a very leading question now. Did you have any kind of opinion on him when he turned up, or any kind of because I find that he's a very even when I first started watching the films, I find that he's got just a very like characterful, sympathetic face. I think he's a great character actor, Takashi Shimura.
To be brutally honest, apart from the villain, there wasn't a lot of. I didn't think this was a film that character work was a strength of.
Yeah.
Was people have their roles and their motivations, and they most of the characters came across as plot functions basically, and I didn't connect to it in that way really. So I did not notice. I
would agree personally on pretty much everyone apart from Takashi Shimura in this film, because they, like, for example, the guy, I've not written down his name actually, he's in a few of Kurosawa's later films as well. The guy who plays Sanshiro, he is a piece of cardboard, unfortunately. But Takashi Shimura has always got these he always looks on the verge of tears. He's got these like great big eyes, and they always look like they're kind of misting over. And I love him. But let's go on to the sequel. So you actually said you preferred this to the first one.
I enjoyed it more, yeah, by quite a margin.
Right.
By quite a margin. It was so to give you a little context. So I've been watching these on the BFI player, which is got a wonderful library and the worst interface of any VOD service that I've ever seen. It's purely browser based, and there's no way to, if it's a subtitled film, the subtitles are on, which obviously you need them obviously, but there's no sort of settings or anything like that. If you come out of a film and go back into it, it doesn't remember your place. It's terrible. It's like it's 10 years out of date. So I was watching it on there, and it opens with the American sailor walking around being an arsehole basically, and the sound recording, because the quality of the film, I don't know if when you watched it, I don't know. I don't think there's a great quality version. Yeah,
it's awful, isn't it? And the sound and everything.
Sound, picture, yeah. And I couldn't really hear what the American sailor was saying, and because he was talking in English, it wasn't subtitled. But I kind of picked up on a few just very standard sort of jock insults that you might see in a cartoon of those times, And I was like, okay,
basically, doesn't he?
He sounds like Popeye.
And he's just kind of muttering, going like, if you do hear him, he's just saying like, "Come on, fight me! Come and get me! Come on! It's just like that. It's nothing. He's not saying anything really.
No, but it's kind of cartoon character. So that was quite. and Sanshiro Sugata kind of intervenes and kind of decides he's going to teach this punk a thing or two. And then what I really loved about this was that the sailor starts to try and have a fight, and he kind of walks him halfway across town to get to the edge by the water.
I mean, that's an interesting sequence. Again, Donald Ritchie in his book, he talks about that sequence as being a kind of mockery of the first film, because it's clearly supposed to pay homage to the first film and to the dog fight, but done just very poorly and with just no style to it, and all done in like just long, boring medium shots. Like that's one of the things with this film. Like I hadn't read, I read the biography years ago, but I'd forgotten about it, so I hadn't read Kurosawa's thoughts on this film prior to watching it again the other day. And there was a point in my notes where I just wrote down, Kurosawa is so bored by this movie. Like there's just long static shots where there's just no imagination going on at all. And then reading his biography and reading him saying, he dedicates like a whole like one page to this film in his biography, where he says, basically he just complains about sequels existing and says that it's bad that the studios want to make them.
Well, this is where we're going to get a little bit, and I am learning. This is where we're going to get a little bit high and low with our references. Do you like what I did?
I did.
Because it put me in mind of. There's one key reference that I'm going to come to, but it put me in mind of The Hangover Part II. because I was like, I can see where this is going to go. We're going to get exactly the same film restaged in different places.
Yeah.
So it's like we've got to get him to the edge of the water so we can throw him over the water.
Yeah. You're right. But
it hit beat by beat, and I surprised that I thought that I was noticing camera moves a little bit more than in the first one. Not that they were saying anything or doing anything. I thought the camera was more dynamic, and it started to think, oh, this is a sequel where everyone knows what to expect, and they've got to just make things a little bit bigger. They've got to make things a little bit more. So we've got to have, rather than the local hoodlums, we've got to get the Yankee sailors in, and he's got to beat up the Yankee sailor. It's got to be the stakes have got to be a little bit higher. And then they start talking about the boxer, and you see the boxer, and I immediately thought Hulk Hogan, Rocky 3. And then when he starts talking to his friend about that he's not going to fight him, that he shouldn't fight him, that it's debasing judo, I was like, this is Rocky 4. This is going to be Rocky 4. I know exactly where this is going.
One of the things I did enjoy watching it again, I've written so many times in my notes in capitals, this is such a sequel, because it's like every single beat. Like the end scene, instead of it being wind in the grass, they're now in the snow. Like it's going to be like a fight on extreme weather. He has to beat the guy by throwing him down a hill. Last one, there's just all these weird bits where it just has to do the same thing again. Even to the point where there's that kind of school of sequels where it's just like look who's talking to. Or honey, I blew up the baby. It's like where in this they're like, well, in the first film it was judo versus jiu-jitsu. Now it's judo against karate and boxing. Like there's two different things he has to fight against. And that cool
extra villains.
And that kind of Die Hard thing, where that villain you like from the first film, these two new villains are related to that villain. It's just such a sequel. But it's interesting to read because, like I say, in his autobiography, he goes on this big rant about it, about how sequels are terrible. It's so interesting as well because
there's so many callbacks as well. Like, do you remember the time you had that fight and and the song? The kids sing a song about you.
Yeah.
And then later on you hear the song again. It's just like they kind of, it's that let's remember the things that we liked about the first one. And
it's interesting hearing Kurosawa talk about it though, because write about it, because his thing is just writing about the fact that he had to make it. And then in the Donald Ritchie book, there's a quote from Kurosawa where he just says, "This film did not interest me in the slightest." Donald Ritchie says it is so very bad. And what's the quote Kurosawa said about it in his in his biography? Kurosawa writes, "It was not a very good film." So he's quite down on it and wasn't interested in making it. And I felt that came across. Like I was watching it, and I'd say again, I read these quotes after I watched it yesterday and was thoroughly sort of unimpressed with it. But I was amazed by how immobile the camera was. Like I felt like in the first film, you get so much more of his style in the first film than you do in the second. The one thing I liked in the second film is this kind of proto Barry Lyndon moment where he has this judo training sequence in the dark and it's all lit by an in-camera light. There's just a random lantern in the front and he's just kind of dancing around his lamp. But apart from that, I found it very flat.
It's weird. My immediate impression was the camera was moving more and it was dynamic, not necessarily for any particular reason, but in a way that it's not really fair to James Cameron, really, but a film comes from this franchise goes from Ridley Scott to James Cameron, who throws his camera around a lot more. I should be talking about Michael Bay, but I can't think of anybody that he's sequelized. I thought it was more dynamic, and that's the impression that I got from it anyway. Maybe I'm totally wrong about that, but that's how it felt when I was watching it. I liked everything just gets pumped up. So the villain who's westernized, but it's quite subtle.
It's just bastard Yanks.
Bastard Yanks with stars and stripes everywhere.
Yeah.
Also,
there's certain things, I'm sure you picked up on them as well because they're not subtle, but there are things that are only really signifies of anything if you understand a little bit about Japanese culture, because of the fact that, for example, you've got a crowd around the boxing ring and they're just cheering and laughing. And to a Western audience, you could just think, well, yeah, they're a crowd at a public event. But, to a Japanese sensibility, and if you compare it to the crowds in the first film, that's not what you do. You sit quietly and you appreciate things. You don't throw your arms around. You don't shout. So just presenting Americans in this particular way in that film, where they're just being like uncouth. They're loud. They're obnoxious. There's women there. You're not allowed women at fights in Japan.
I'm sure it's probably hits home a little bit more and a bit more bombastic if you're familiar with that. But to be honest, I think it's quite easy to pick up on that anyway, given it's clear that even within the disciplines boxing and judo, it's much more of a bloodlust thing. And this idea that the action in the film is never really played for violence; it's played for drama. Whereas the boxing is clearly a spectacle act of violence to satisfy bloodlust. So I think that comes across really, really nicely. And there was you get the idea that this is American culture sort of poisoning the well there's even
a line in it where there's some line in it where somebody complains about Japanese youth wearing Western styles. Do you remember that? There's just some old man who's like, "Oh, kids today wearing American clothes."
What I also liked about it was that the film doesn't even necessarily hold to its own internal logic, because there's this bit where they're talking about the boxing to begin with, and he says, "I will not fight for entertainment," and then his next line almost is that he wants to go and see what boxing looks like. And I don't know if it's just a know your enemy thing, but he seems to be sort of half smiling when he says it, as if, "Oh, yeah, I'm not going to do it." Yeah, exactly.
I also like the sort of the take backsies that he does on giving the guy the winnings, because he defeats the boxer, and then to sort of like punctuate how cool he is and he doesn't care about money, he just puts the wad of money on his defeated opponent, and then as they're carrying his defeated opponent away, he kind of goes back and gets the money, gives it to somebody else. And it seems like if you were being really disciplined from a sort of screenwriting perspective, somewhere along the line there, you would cut out the time he gave it to the guy defeated, and you would just have him give it to the other guy first. It seems like just wasted air.
But this is what I liked about it. This is what I really, really liked about. This is why I enjoyed it more, I think, because it was done. Like the first one they're both commercial, commercial kind of sports films. And if the first one's The Karate Kid, which is dated, but when you go back and watch it, is a solid film with decent logic to it. And this is Rocky IV. It's bombastic, jingoistic, silly, over the top, and I think because the first one is obviously notable for being his first film, but is not a film I will ever feel the need to revisit. And I don't know, would you have ever gone back and watched it if we weren't doing this?
No, never. The only bit in the first film that I would ever go back to watch again for any particular reason, the fight at the docks at the beginning. No, that's funny. But the fight at the docks at the beginning of the movie is the bit that I really like from the first film. If I was doing a highlights reel of Kurosawa moments, that would probably be there would probably be a bit of that in it. Yeah. Other than that, I'm not a massive stan for Sanshiro Sugata, but I find it interesting, and I do think a lot of his preoccupations, the themes, the techniques, a lot of them you can see in that first film that you will then notice coming through into the other films. One thing I'll say, because we should probably wrap up, one thing I'll mention on the way out, have you heard of Seigata Sanshiro?
No.
Okay. Seigata Sanshiro you can look it up on YouTube. It's a Sega Saturn marketing campaign that was apparently really popular in Japan. There was loads of ads of it all the way up to like the Dreamcast era. But it was like when the Sega Saturn came out, Sugata Sanshiro is clearly a famous enough character that they just had a parody of him in those ads called Seigata Sanshiro. And all the ads are just this guy, and kids are like singing about him, like in the way they do in the film. And he's just kind of marching around the streets, just like punching stuff or whatever, judoing things. But it's just funny because it's this like weird, outlandish 90s Japanese commercial for a video game thing, but it's referencing this Kurosawa movie from the 40s, which is interesting. It's also interesting because one of the things that comes across, like I do have some Japanese friends, and when I ask them about movies, they're always very surprised. I guess it's the same with a Western audience as well. If you ask American friends or British friends, but they're always very surprised I've even watched old movies because they don't watch them. You know, I guess it would be exactly the same if I said to like just a British person, like, "Oh, have you seen Citizen Kane or whatever?" It'd be like, "Well, why would I watch that? It's old." You know, I guess it's the same thing. But what's interesting is that most of the Japanese, well, in fact, every Japanese person I've ever spoken to has never seen any of these movies. They don't care about Kurosawa.
Any of them?
Not the ones I've spoken. I've got a huge sample. I'm not saying
okay. No, sorry. We're talking cross purposes. I thought you meant Kurosawa as opposed to. I thought you meant Sanshiro Sugata. I was like, because when you were talking about that Sega Saturn thing, I was wondering because there's been so many
remakes and
remakes. Is this like a iconic character that is permeated popular culture? And
yeah, I guess so. Because my experience is that Japanese people I've spoken to don't particularly know about Kurosawa or give too much of a shit about him in that respect. And it's something that's kind of borne out by I did go to Japan for a couple of weeks. You can't find film museums there. You know, you can't find, there's no Kurosawa museum. There's nothing to go and like see. Like if you want to go and do like Kurosawa tourism, it's the same with Ozu. The only option would be to like visit their grave. That's like the only thing you can do. There's not a film museum. There's not like a place celebrating it. You don't go around, like if you go around the shops in Japan, you don't see lots of like, you know, Seven Samurai stuff's not on bags and stuff. Like it's not a mainstream thing in the popular culture. I think some of those things have lived on more in Japan through remakes and adaptations, like with Sugata Sanshiro, as you say. Like, because for example, Seven Samurai, I think, has had at least one, maybe two, like anime series have been made, like to adapt it. So I'm wondering whether, you know, obviously with like robots and people with like like massive swords and shit, but like, you know, so I think some of those things have had a cultural footprint. But I'm not sure. And like, if anyone Japanese is like listening or watching this, I would really love your input on like what your relationship with it is, whether you have any interest in this material, or I guess if you're watching this, you do. But it'd be interesting to know how that permeates, because I really don't know how much this permeates pop culture. And one of the things I've always heard about Kurosawa since I've had an interest is that he did struggle to some extent with Japanese audiences. The Japanese audiences did like some of his contemporaries better and saw them as more Japanese, whereas Kurosawa was often dismissed as being too westernized. So yeah, I'm just interested whether if anyone knows any sort of more insight on that from the Japanese perspective. So any more to add from you?
No. I need to I mean, I know really, but for a what's the word? For a contrivance, for the sake of the audience, I need to know my homework for the next podcast.
Yeah, well, we're going to do, as I said, the first 6 of his films. I think it makes sense to do them in pairs. Firstly, because there's not necessarily as much to get into with them as I think hoping there will be with the future ones, but also because they kind of link up thematically in hopefully interesting ways. So next time we're going to do The Most Beautiful and Those Who Tread on the Tiger's Tail, which are both much more overtly propagandistic in different ways. The Most Beautiful is also interesting because it's his only film that has women in the main roles. Like all his films are very masculine. The Most Beautiful actually stars an actress who later became his wife and then stopped acting, which doesn't speak volumes for the Kurosawa household, I guess. But yeah,
same as Kubrick. Same as Kubrick.
Yeah, exactly. You're right. But also, so yeah, we're going to do The Most Beautiful and Those Who Tread on the Tiger's Tail, which are both kind of during the war propagandistic movies. in two very different ways, but they're both propagandistic. And then the next episode, episode 3, will be No Regrets for Our Youth and One Wonderful Sunday, which are both immediately post-war of his early films. And they kind of, one of them reflects on the way that kind of Japan is post-war and the kind of the people trying to get by, and the other one's kind of a bit of a revisionist history of like, oh, we never liked the fascists anyway. So we're going to do them in those little groups, and then after that we should be able to head into them probably on a film by film basis, but that's
Excellent.
The plan.
Well, I just want to say thank you to anyone who's stuck with us for the first episode while we find our feet with the formatting and all that kind of stuff. And hopefully you'll join us again next time.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Do we have any socials? Do we have any emails or anything like that set up already?
Yeah, I've created an email address for the podcast, which is KurosawaCast pod. KurosawaCast was taken. KurosawaCastpod@gmail.com. If you have any questions or feedback, we'll obviously check the comments on when we put this up on YouTube. And please, all the like and subscribe and all that stuff. We're going to put this up as a podcast as well. Maybe that's where you're now listening to it. But at the point of recording this, we don't know where it's going. But hopefully, as we kind of put out new episodes, that'll all become clearer.
It's always such a weird thing on podcasts to sort of tell people where to find them from, because if they're listening, they found them. It's one of the most redundant things on podcasts.
Yeah, I suppose the only thing is, as we put this up on YouTube, we can let people know where they can download it in podcast form if they would prefer for their listening pleasure.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for listening. As Craig said, thanks for sticking through it with us. And yeah, we look forward to seeing you again next time.
Bye-bye. We don't have a sign-off yet, but bye-bye.
No sign-off. We'll do that next time. Bye.